All right, looks like everyone is getting in and connecting to audio. So good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to today's advocacy update. I'm your host, and as Mr. Tallman likes to call me, the traffic cop today, Austin Harris. I'm the Director of Member Engagement here at KASB, and I'm joined by our wonderful advocacy team. As always, we've got Mr. Mark Tallman with us,
Hello.
Leah Fliter, and Scott Rothschild.
Hello.
And we are joined today for a conversation by Dr. Britton Hart here from KASB and G.A. Bule from USA, Kansas.
Good afternoon.
So we're excited to have everyone here today for a good conversation based on some questions that Mr. Tallman threw out to the world earlier this week in a series of blog posts, really targeted at what legislators are going to be asked and what legislators are going to be asking of educational leaders. And so we're going to dig into those 5 questions and open up some opportunity for our panel to have some conversation about what we might all be expecting as we head into the legislative session. As we do that, as always, you're welcome to throw any questions you have into the chat, and I'll keep an eye on that and try to ask those questions as we move along. And there are several things happening in the world of advocacy this week, and particularly today. So we're keeping our eye on the Capitol, and if we see some news we want to jump in and talk about, we'll certainly do that as well. So Mark, let's get started with your 5 questions, and we're just going to take these in order today. 5 great questions that legislators are undoubtedly preparing for at this point as they head into the 2020 legislative session. Your first question was, how are districts working to improve student learning, and what impact will the COVID pandemic have on student learning and health? So Mark, give us a brief overview of that question and what you think the context of that is for our education leaders.
I think it breaks down into sort of 2 points, kind of the long-term, what's happening with student learning, what's happening with academic achievement and success, and the more immediate issue of the impact of COVID, and they're going to be tied together. I really think it's important to remember in the context of student learning, many of you that I see on here have kind of been with your school system through the Gannon years, through the lawsuits, and it's always important to remember that the whole premise of Gannon was that money matters, that our learning wasn't where it needed to be because our funding wasn't where it needed to be, and as we got more funding, we'd see learning improve. And so long before COVID, we had a situation where legislators, particularly those skeptical of that premise, were going to be worried about, okay, we want to start seeing some results. And the fact is, through the first year or two of increased funding, we didn't see many results. Now, some will say, and that may be one of the things we want to talk about, it takes a little bit of time. When funding was cut, we didn't necessarily see test scores and things fall right away. But that's an expectation. Now, that may be changed because most people, I think, believe that the impact of the pandemic is going to set us back. The question is, how long is that a legitimate excuse? And so as much as everyone is just trying to stay afloat right now, we're going to have legislators wanting to know, all right, we've given you more money. You want to keep getting more money. You're scheduled to get more money under Gannon. What are we going to be seeing as far as results? What are your districts doing about that? Last thing I'll note, maybe before letting people begin to react, is the State Board of Education has taken this a little different view, although they're the ones that kind of put out the dollar amount that was largely accepted as the Gannon settlement. They've also been pushing the idea of school redesign. And to me, what that says is, of course, resources are part of it, but it's also a matter of how you use them. And if you get more money, but still keep doing the same things with it, maybe you're not going to get a change in results. So part of school redesign is to say, whether you're a formal redesigned school or not, what are we doing differently to improve student success, particularly among those kids who haven't been successful? So I think that the very top thing we have to be prepared to talk about is, how are our school districts tackling that issue long-term and short-term of helping our kids succeed?
And Mark, I'll jump in there. I think our schools are going to have to step up and kind of show, just like you said, what we're doing. But there are some great things going on around the state. And when I say great thing, I don't know that we're necessarily closing any achievement gaps right now, but I think we're maintaining. And I think that's the piece that we're going to have to look for as we move forward. Well, some of these folks may have seen Dr. Gene Kearns' webinar last week. Gene's with Renaissance Learning put together a study around the nation that the gap in reading has only dropped about 1%. And so very little drop in reading. And again, I think that happens because of a couple of reasons. I think people can read at home. I think parents are very comfortable supporting their kids at home with reading, and that continues to move forward. The big gap that we're starting to see, though, is in the area of math and science, because parents are not comfortable with that, or we're not able to get the resources we need to get to the kids. And so, I think the challenge as we continue to move forward is we've got to stop maintaining and figure out how we can find ways to get the teachers back in the classroom, get the kids back in the classrooms, and have more meaningful learning, and really meet those changes as we're going forward. But the challenge that our schools are running into is our communities, and our communities trying to get them to do what they need to do to keep our kids in school. And I think that's where people are don't see the connection between our community and what our schools need to make that successful. Because if we've got these enormous rates of COVID in our community, it's really difficult to keep kids in schools, because number one, we can't keep teachers in school. They're getting sick or being quarantined. Number two, we don't have substitutes to fill in for them. And then what that does is it puts unqualified people back in those classrooms, and it's difficult to make those changes or create those changes. So I think as we move forward, we have to continue to reiterate that this isn't just a school issue or a school problem. It's a community or a statewide challenge that we've got to work together in. And one group working against another group isn't going to solve this.
Well, the other thing
Okay, those are some really good insights. And I wanted to share, I was just on a call that was hosted by Governor Kelly and was attended by, I think, several hundred elected officials from around the state, counties, cities, all those kinds of things. And that was a point that they were trying to make, is that if we can all work together to embrace a unified campaign to address this virus, we could keep our businesses open and we could keep our schools open, but that we all really have to work together. And that I think we'll see, starting next week, a real unified campaign statewide with several very prominent stakeholders and a lot of grassroots efforts to try to help all of us keep our kids in school. Dr. Hart, I think I interrupted you.
No, that's a good point, both of you. The thing I wanted to echo that marries with both of your comments is that I think it's a little early to tell whether the data is really going to reciprocate, whether we're going to go a dramatic increase or decrease. But what I will tell you, based on our conversations with superintendents and boards, is some of the things that our boards and our school districts are doing that are innovative and that are really tapping into the learning needs of all kids. I think what will be exciting to see, and a point to continue to kind of ponder, is what are those points that we're going to hold on to after we get this virus under control? What are these new ways of learning, and what are the new opportunities that we have for kids? How are we going to secure them, and how are we going to keep those to really kind of transform our system to better address all kids? Those things we're probably not quite ready to assess yet, but I think we've learned through this last 6 months, there's some different ways to do things. And those things are going to be proof in the pudding, whether we keep them or not, as we continue to address our kids.
And I just want to pick up on one thing GA said real quick about looking at that, looking at what's happening. You're going to have that information. The state isn't. Those of us who work at the state level, we're not going to have a state assessment data from last year, maybe to this year at all. We don't know. But where you are using individual assessments and that sort of thing, and when you're doing what Dr. Hart said about here's things we're putting into place to try, we're not going to have a comprehensive list of that. And that's why it's so important that you be sharing that with your local representatives about what you're doing and what you're seeing. That's information only you have. And if you don't talk about both the positive news and the challenges and how you're responding, then other groups will control that narrative.
Well, and I'll just add that I think coming into the legislative session, all indications are the governor's office is going to support the Gannon funding for the coming year. But there's going to be a lot of demands on the budget, a lot of it COVID related, and a lot of it, businesses are going to be seeking tax cuts because businesses have suffered. And there's going to be movements to replenish the unemployment fund and things like that. So while the governor's budget will most likely include the Gannon funding, there will be a lot of, I wouldn't say opposition to that, but I'll say there will be a lot of demands on the budget from other areas. So again, we obviously have to make our case very strongly.
Yeah, that's a great segue into the second of our 5 questions today, Scott. And the second question Mark posed was, how has the COVID pandemic affected your school district's operations? And Mark, my initial answer is, how hasn't the COVID pandemic impacted school operations and district operations? But from where you're standing, how do you think legislators are going to approach this question?
A good way to think of, I always say, legislators, a lot of ways you can categorize legislators. There are some that they're pro-education is how they style themselves. Maybe they've been in the system. They've been an administrator, a teacher, a school board member. They've got a lot of trust already built up. There's another group of people who are real skeptics. They're kind of skeptical. They want to show me anything. Prove to me you're doing right. Prove to me you're spending the money correctly. And there's a group in the middle who are just kind of still generally questioning. So I think when anything has happened, people are going to look at it through that lens. So for example, in my 5 questions, one of the things I note is last spring, everybody was thrown into the boat of we're out of school. We have to scramble to put together continuous learning plans, do the best we can. One thing is just to remember, we're going to have a lot of legislators who weren't in the legislature last year. They don't remember that. They may not know what you did. And unless they're kind of familiar with their school system, you know who legislators tend to hear from? People who have complaints, not people who are happy with the way things are. So part of it, you have to be prepared to talk about what happened and why and what you did last spring. Then we came into a world where there was the fight over the summer. When do we open schools? And the governor's proposal to put off that delay. The legislature changed the law to say the state board has to approve that. They didn't. And so, we tend to say we like local control. Well, we really got all the local control you could ask for. And so we had districts starting on time. We had districts that still haven't brought everybody back. So there's no one story, but most legislators, they only know what they hear and see in their district. And they're hearing from people who are unhappy about it. So part of what this issue, part of the question I'm saying they're going to have that you need to fill is, what's been happening since then to how you operate? How did you determine your opening plan? How are you determining now what learning environment you're in? What's happened to your staff numbers? What happened to your retirements? Have you been able to fill positions? What's your situation with substitutes? Again, those of you that deal with this all the time think it's obvious. You're going to have a lot of elected officials who have no idea what it takes to run a school district. So the second kind of group of questions is, what are you going to do to explain how this pandemic has affected the way you operate and how it may affect things going forward, simply from a staffing and a learning environment viewpoint?
Mark, and I think that's one of the challenges for our educators right now, because we become this, we fall into a sense of complaining about what's going on. And I don't know that that's what legislators want to hear. I think they want to hear what adjustments have we made, or what have been the obstacles that we've had to overcome along the way, or what are still the obstacles that we have to overcome. And I think those are the pieces that we have to continue to compile. But I think your very first part, Mark, was really, really relevant from the standpoint that our legislators are hearing from the people that are complaining. And what we have to be able to do are find those people that have been involved in the process, our community members, our school board members, our site council members, and help our legislators understand what went into these decisions and why decisions were made to stay remote, or to go to a hybrid, or why this type of hybrid. I think I think the more we can help people understand how the decision was made, not that anybody wants to watch the sausage be made, but this is what's really important right now is how are those decisions made and what obstacles were in the way that we had to try to overcome, drive around, or whatever the case may have been, to get where we are today. And then what are our plans moving forward? Because again, we're not out of the woods when we hit January. We're not out of the woods when people start getting the vaccine. This is going to be here for the next 6, 7, maybe even 12 months that we're dealing with remnants of these challenges, and we have to continue to help people understand what the planning and the challenges look like without complaining.
You know, the saying that resonates when you guys talk about this is, if who's going to tell your story? Do you want to tell it, or do you want somebody else to tell it for you? And living with a teacher, it is evident that our teachers have done nothing but be resilient and be the backbone of what our kids have needed during this time. And our districts have stepped up. When you think about operations, we're running more bus routes. We have more classified folks. We have more people to make smaller classroom environments. We're doing everything necessary to try to support every kid. When we were thrown into this last spring, it was tough to make those quick adjustments operationally. And now our districts have had some time, and now they're doing those small things to make sure all kids are getting what they need. But again, I think it kind of echoes back to what you said, GA. We need to make sure that those stories and that information is being told, and letting know that, hey, it does cost more. It does take more operations. It is more difficult. And those are things that we need to make sure people can hear.
So one of the questions that would be hanging out there, Mark, GA, Britton, how do we help tell that story? You know, if we're someone who works in the district office, if we're a school board member, how do we tell that story to our legislators and to the officials at the state?
You know, I guess one thing is, a lot of these we're talking about what legislators want to know. This is the time of year when legislators are starting to think about the session. They're wanting to know what their constituents feel about things. So many of you may already have planned to invite legislators to come to your board or to an area meeting. Some of those have already happened. If you got a new legislator, it's a great time to introduce yourself on a personal level. If you have the opportunity to invite people, you know, depending on the environment you're in, to come to a board meeting, to come to a district. So you've got an easy window now to approach them when they'll be hopefully preparing to listen. But the other side of that is, well, then you got to be prepared with what you want to say. And that's why part of the reason we kind of put these questions down is to give you a way to organize in your own mind things you want to hit. You may not feel you can hit all of them or need to, but pull out those things you think are most relevant to what you know you want to say. The other thing is, I'm guessing, because you live in your communities, you also know the criticism that's being spread out there. You know the negative things that are going to be heard. Are being told. So that puts you in a position to think about, how am I going to counter that, you know, in a way that isn't defensive, but simply tries to lay out the facts. What do some of the rest of you think?
Well, I think the other thing is, if, you know, in the past, we've had opportunities where we brought schools together, and we've had meeting with our, you know, local senator or representatives. We've done things together. And I think we can continue to do that, but I think it's time for us, rather than asking questions, I think it's time for us to take the offensive and show what we've done. You know, if you got a county's worth of superintendents and board members together to have a conversation with the legislators and say, hey, this is what we've done and this is how we've done it, I think that's really valuable before they get to Topeka. Because once they get to Topeka, they're going to hear other stories, and they're going to hear stories from the outside. Like Britton was saying earlier, they're going to hear the stories from the outside, and we want them to understand, you know, first of all, what's happening on the inside. And from as a longtime principal, I can tell you the story I heard first was the story that resonated the most. And so I always wanted to be the first one to a parent with the story before the kid got to the parent with the story, because my story was going to resonate first. And I think that's kind of where we're at right now. The quicker we can get to these folks and help them understand where we're at and what we're doing, I think the better off we are.
Well, and I'd just kind of like to add one thing. I think Mark and Leah and GA are just highly respected in the State House and are go-to sources there for a lot of legislators. But if a legislator can hear from someone from home, that's just golden, and that's what they need to hear from the folks back home. So anytime you can tell your story to the particular legislator, that just means a lot to them, I think.
Well, and we actually met with some school advocates yesterday, and we don't know to what extent we'll even be in the State House this year.
Yeah.
It hasn't been decided to how open it'll be, how many people will be in committee rooms, and so some of our opportunities to just build personal relationships in the hallway and between meetings and those sorts of things, that may not even exist. And that's why it's going to be all the more important that our legislators and other officials are hearing from their constituents. That's always critical, as Scott said. I think this year it's going to be even more important because statewide organizations may have less opportunity to go to get to legislators. We're going to have to be trying to work through all of you and your colleagues around the state.
You know, and I think our boards and our superintendents know the value of that communication, the importance of it. And I think they're just so overwhelmed with this fall, and they're tired and they're beat down a little bit I'm hopeful that after the holidays, they're going to be able to take that refocus and start to tell that story again, because they are doing good things and they are resilient. But sometimes that's the last thing on their mind is to tell that story while they're doing things in their district and doing the heavy lifting. So I think the sunny days are ahead, and I think that's a good way to look at it. And our boards and our superintendents are going to rise, and they're going to be able to tell that story that people need to hear.
There's certainly plenty for them to talk about. Mark, your third question sticks to the idea that COVID's impacted pretty much every level of public education, particularly operational. And so question 3 is, how has COVID affected your budget? In particularly, you ask, if districts have fewer students or are operating remotely without students on site, shouldn't there, if you're a legislator, perhaps be cost savings? So what perspective is this getting looked at, and how do you see this question being asked, Mark?
Well, just as it's phrased, I think that to the average legislator who may not be familiar with schools, to the average person in the street, the average taxpayer, you know, their question is, we understand what it takes to run schools, but if you're not running schools in the same way, then why is it cost the same, or even more, which you're asking us for? The other thing is, legislators have heard, and we'll hear again and again, school districts got money to deal with this. You know, nearly $90 million in direct federal aid, substantial additional funding from counties that are being provided. So legislators are basically saying, yeah, we may understand why you've got some higher costs, but you also ought to have savings, and you got more money. So the real question, and again, this comes back to something at our level, we don't have your budget data, and we won't for a while. So the question is, how do you respond to, and maybe you need to tell us a different answer. If the world looks different, why does it always cost more? I'll throw that out to some of my colleagues to help them answer that.
Toilet paper, of course.
Rapid inflation.
Well, so is this the one I have to answer myself? You're gonna let me lobby on that. I'll throw it. Britton, you got your hand up. Go ahead.
Yeah, well, let me just ask you a question. That's maybe a better way to go about this, is that if you think about where the majority of our district budgets lie, it's in personnel. Okay. Personnel really in the state of COVID hasn't dramatically increased because of the demand of classified staff, transportation, para support, aides, people that are trying to make class sizes smaller and more maintainable for social distancing and wearing masks. Where would the major cost then be, Mr. Tallman, if we were going to have some reductions, and we know it's not going to be in personnel? What is the small pool of money that maybe we could reduce in? Where would those funds come from?
Well, but I think, again, if I
Mark,
Yeah.
Before you get too far out there, I want to kind of respond to Britton's piece. And Mark, you put out the staffing piece the other day, and I visited with some superintendents about that. And one of the challenges that we're running in with our staffing right now is, although our staffing may not have increased a great deal, our staff is doing more. So we have bus drivers that are running double routes. We have teachers that are teaching all day long, and then they're teaching an after-school program. We've got all kinds of other things going on. So although our numbers haven't increased, what have increased is the time that they're at school and they're doing other components at school. So I think that's as we talk about staffing, we have to be careful to have people hone in on just a teacher working 8 hours a day. If they're having to work 2 hours in the study hall or to pick other pieces up, I think those are additional expenses that are not necessarily relevant or not necessarily as easy to see on a staffing chart that Mr. Tallman put out.
I would concur with GA on that. I think, Donna and I have noticed that staffing it's hard to fill positions, and it's hard to find, especially classified. Well, I say especially classified staff. We have plenty of licensed staff vacancies as well, but with your classified staff, if you're trying to do more work than ever with a small pool of people, we're going to be paying a lot of overtime. Or for any of these people, if they're out because of they have to.
Angie, you muted.
Sorry, did you hear any of that?
Yes, all except the last little bit.
That's a fun time where my lips were moving and nothing. But I guess what I was trying to say was we're dealing with also having to pay for staff leave and substitutes, where we haven't had to do that as much in the past, whether it's people that are quarantining. Some of your licensed staff might be able to do their work, and then you have to backfill with people actually in person if the staff are working remotely to watch the kids, to be there for any kind of issues they may have in the actual classroom. But if our food service staff is gone, we have to pay substitutes, and we have to then also pay leave. And so there are a lot of, I think, leave issues and overtime issues and things like that we need to make clear to legislators.
Yeah, and what I would just say is the key thing to remember, and thank you, Angie just joined us before, wasn't here for the beginning. So you got that insight, and any other legal questions, I'm sure she'd be happy to take. But the key thing to understand is a lot of the things you just said, I don't believe that the average person on the street even begins to think about. The whole issue of what might it mean for overtime? What might happen to our substitute costs? So those may seem obvious to all of you who manage schools, but remember, most people don't manage schools. So part of the issue, and I think that's a good point, is our numbers are down. Well, why is that? Is it because you're having trouble attracting people? And if you're having to replace them in different ways or overtime, that's going to offset that savings. I think a couple of other things to keep in mind that's important. Number one is the biggest part of any district's budget is your licensed staff, particularly your teachers who are under contract. So to some extent, whether if you're operating remotely or not remotely, or even have fewer kids, you're still going to be paying all of those costs. Number two, the legislature gave directive that says they want everybody to be paid. So, last fall, even people who weren't working were expected to be paid, and districts were trying to find ways to do that. So we're kind of in the same boat now. Is it the legislator's intention to cut people back? We could save money if we didn't pay people as much, but then we're not going to have those people. And if you're in an environment where, well, we had to shut down for a couple of weeks or didn't start as early, well, maybe that could save you some bus driver time, or maybe that could save you some in those areas. But if we expect school to start up again, which is what everyone wants, you're going to have those employees in place to do that. And then finally, another set of costs having to do with buildings. Yes, if you have students, if you don't have people in buildings at all, there may be savings, but you still have to upkeep those buildings for when you bring them back. And if you're operating in a hybrid environment, in part because you're spacing people out, you may need more space. All I'm coming back to is saying is these are things that are not obvious initially. And I think you literally need to be writing these down and preparing to say, so how do I explain this? One other point, I'll get some more reaction. I think we're also going to have to help people understand what was the balance between additional costs that we're talking about and the money, the federal dollars that came in, and how does that balance district for district? Because it wasn't awarded on the basis of how much maybe you needed. It was awarded based on other formulas. So we don't know how that's all going to lie out. Also, some districts got money from counties under the Spark process. To our knowledge, some didn't get any or very little. So how much help districts got could also vary significantly county to county.
Mr. Tallman, do we have any early data about the amount of money that districts have spent on kind of beefing up their technology and infrastructure, broadband, those resources that sometimes we don't take into account because of staffing, but that we had to ramp up to make sure that we address equity and addressed all students' needs this fall? Got any data on any of that?
Unless Leah knows something I don't, at this point, always have is anecdotal evidence that it happened. Because again, remember, that's the level of detail that districts rarely report to the state. And if they do, it's usually a lagging report anyway. Right now, for example, we have your preliminary budgets that you filed. We have your preliminary enrollment, but how you're actually spending money, to the best of my knowledge, no one is collecting. And we'd love to have it, but we don't know how much, we don't know how many other KSB or USA surveys you want to fill out and send in. So it's going to be real. We may not ask you for it, but you've got your own data, and that's part of what needs to be shared.
Okay, well, sounds like no one wants to jump in anymore on the budget side of things. We just let Mr. Tallman run with that primarily.
Thank
you. Yeah, we're always happy to do that for you, Mark.
You know, I want to, hey, maybe before you leave that, just because I'm seeing something in the chat, I also think it's really important to be telling what is happening with your true quarantine experience. Because, you know, as we went through the summer and everything, a lot of the question was, well, when do we start school? We had all this gating criteria, but what is the day-to-day impact of people coming into quarantine and people moving out of quarantine? What has been the impact of your work with your county in this area? And how much is your county asking you to do, and what help can they provide, and where are they getting text out? So that I think is part of really these kind of last two questions, operations and budget. The other piece to remember is, once again, you know what's happening with your quarantine experience. You can't assume that other people do. And so and then again, that's another thing that isn't reported to anybody that I know. We have no idea on a given day or week or month how many teachers are in quarantine, how many students are in quarantine, and the impact that's having.
Yeah, Mark, I think you make a great point that your average person's not thinking about these things nearly in the detail we are. And the reality is most of our legislators are average people with other lives and other jobs and a lot of things on their plate. So they may not be thinking about it, but it really makes sense once you start having a conversation. They can go, well, of course that happened. And of course this cost crept in. And of course you had to deal with this. They're just not right there thinking about it in real time. So important to have those conversations. Britton, there was a comment there to your question that Manhattan-Ogden has invested approximately $1.5 million for devices, hotspots, and remote access components. So certainly across the state, an impact financially on trying to gear up that remote access for students throughout districts.
I think that's another great example, Mark, and you kind of alluded to this. There are so many underlying expenses that the districts have been just kind of forced to pick up or to pay that aren't in the budget. I mean, we're just, well, we got to have this to have school, or we've got to do this. We've got to pay for this for our kids. And there are so many of those underlying elements there that maybe are preliminarily aren't in the budget, or may not be in the budget next year, but they've got to be there. They've got to be there right now.
And another great point put in the chat from Turner about just that impact of no district is an island. And so
Right.
your staff may be affected in different ways by other people's decisions that you may have to respond to. But I do think it's really important as we have these conversations to be really empathetic to our communities and our families. We've got a lot of explanations here that are true, but to go back to the mindset of, hey, what I know is you school board, closed operations. My kid had to stay home, so I couldn't go to work. So I don't know how I'm going to pay the rent, and I'm not prepared to be their teacher. Those are absolutely real world situations as well. And so an explanation is important. You understand that's not going to satisfy everybody, and it's really important to make it in the context of why we're doing what we are and how we're trying to avoid making it even worse.
Mark, your fourth question is one that I think most people in this group will kind of chuckle at a little bit, because question number 4 is, what is the Gannon school finance case, an agreement reached between the legislature, governor, and Kansas Supreme Court? And like much of what we've talked about today, to those of us in the world of public education whose lives are tied to public education closely, we know what the Gannon case is. We know the history of the Gannon case. We understand the agreement, where it came from and where it's going. But as you've pointed out many times, one, our legislators aren't necessarily as in tune with the world of public education as many of us are. And many of the legislatures, more than in really a normal year, are new to the Capitol and don't have that background and that history of the Gannon case. So how do you see this question being asked, and what are some of the easy ways to respond to those legislators trying to figure out what exactly they're walking into?
The critical issue here, and this is where it gets so complicated, I've heard from some of our members talking about, well, our enrollment's down and we're not going to get as much money as we expected. That's a problem if you budgeted it. But remember, this year, statewide, we're pouring in well over $100 million more in state aid. And next year, we're going to put in about another $100 million more in base state aid only, not to mention extra funding and some of the other things that are going on. My guess is that most districts will still have more money if you look at the budget, you're going to spend more money than you did a year ago. It may not be as much as you thought. So why is that? And again, so if I'm a legislator, hey, I've got agencies where people haven't had a pay raise and we're cutting, and we've got mental health needs, and we've got public safety needs, and our local communities are struggling and they're laying off people. So public education, why are you so special? Why are you not only asking not to be cut, you're asking to get more? So I think it's important to go back to the point of the Gannon was, we found that for what we want our schools to do, we were underfunded by much statistical data, and the legislature agreed to a plan to basically just get us back to where we were 10 years ago when you adjust for inflation. So that's what we're in the middle of. The increase we're getting is not really to give us more, it's to get us back to where studies said we needed to be to get the outcomes we're expected to do. That explains base state increase. The other side of the coin is, the legislature continues to put more money into things like local option budget aid, put more money into, capital improvements, capital outlay aid, CAPER, some of those things. So the other part of the Gannon story that's really important to remember is, if the legislature doesn't fund those programs, it has a different impact on districts due to their wealth. And it means that some districts will pay a heavier price from a budget viewpoint if that doesn't happen, from either what they lose or the taxes they have to raise. So I guess, what I've simply stated in these questions, it's important for you to help your legislators understand where your district stands in assessed valuation for pupil. In other words, for people who don't understand the school finance formula, are you a relatively wealthy district or a relatively poor district? Your legislators need to know how their decisions about funding equalization programs can affect their district uniquely and individually. And in terms of increasing base state aid, which we saw drop for about 8 years and is now coming back, what did you lose? If you can go back and look, the kind of things you had to do, positions cut, programs cut, salaries falling behind. And what are you doing with the money that's coming in? Again, we know COVID kind of changes everything, but most of you, we hope, we're in a plan to say, it's what we said, well, you're getting maybe less than you expected. What were those expectations based on? Continuing to get your salaries back to be more competitive, restoring positions that were cut, adding targeted new programs for mental health or for counseling or for CTE, all those things that we know you've been investing in. So helping people understand that the Gannon decision is not just something the big bad Supreme Court said we had to do. There was a reason for it, and those decisions affect your districts and what you can do for your students, your families, and your taxpayers.
And Mark, I think that's where it's important to show your work, to show that we had X amount of CARES funds, we had X amount of Spark funds that we received. All of that money went to these various areas and it was spent. It was spent with extra expenses. So as all of the new money that came into us was blown through pretty quickly with extraneous expenses we did not budget for, we also have a cut to our budget because we have fewer students. And so, I mean, I think the more we can share information on how that new funding was spent and spent quickly, the better we'll be able to address that issue.
Angie, I love your phrase, show your work. And I guess that's the whole point. We know this is one more thing you have to do. This is one more report you have to put together. But I suspect many of you had some of these conversations with your boards that you shared, that your administration has brought in, or that you've presented. What we're just saying is don't neglect to do those same things. Explain how we got here, where we want to go, and how some of the things we've been talking about play into that. What you wanted to do that you couldn't because now you can't get people in COVID. Programs you couldn't do because you can't get students together in the same way.
I mean, Britton, GA goes to your original points of tell your story. And there's going to be lots of stories once the legislators get to the Capitol. So what are the stories our members need to be telling, and how do they tell these stories around the Gannon case?
And I'll add one piece into that. And Austin, thanks for that lead in there. One of those stories that gets hit pretty hard every year is our reserves, those reserve funds. And again, I don't think any school district should be embarrassed about having money in reserves, because right now you need to spend you need those dollars to spend, and you have reasons that they're there. The biggest piece is, though, you need to be able to explain those dollars. Why do we have 15% of our budget in reserves? And again, it's easy in most cases to explain, or even if you've got 25%, because we're saving to build onto this building, we're saving to do these types of school safety pieces. Those are all just fine, and they're perfectly good explanations. But when a legislator looks at a piece of paper, all they see is a percent of a budget, and it's all about telling your story of why we're doing X, Y, or Z, and why it's important to our community. And I think, again, it continues to build what you're doing, because I don't see any school districts of our 286 school districts doing anything wrong. And we're reaching out to our private schools more than we've ever reached out before and supporting those kids in those schools. But again, it's up to us to tell the story, because there are underlying stories that are being told about our schools, and many of them are not correct, or they're only about half the truth. And so again, it all falls into our hands to make sure people understand what those issues are and why we're doing what we're doing.
GA, you've snuck into question 5. Austin is too much of a gentleman to mention that. So I may have a thing or two to add, but was there anything else anyone wanted to say on Gannon before we beat the horse of reserves a little bit more?
Mr. Tallman always finds a good segue to the next point of conversation. And GA did touch a little bit on question number 5, which what are school district cash balances or reserve levels, and why? And it really taps back into the bulk of our conversation, that your average legislator may not even know that school districts have those reserve funds on hand. And if they don't have that base understanding, they certainly don't understand the why behind what those reserves are for, what functions they serve, and why your school district might have them. So Mark, what do you think some of the questions around this are going to be? And to the group, how do we start to answer those? How do we have those conversations?
Well, in some ways, what we tend to hear from legislators is a little different. GA says, well, why do you have X percent? Honestly, the question is usually, why do you have $3 billion in reserves? I mean, that's a huge number. And I think part of the first question is to point out, well, our reserves have been rising, but they haven't really been rising as a percent of budget. Districts tend to get higher because I think most people with the experience with their household or with a business understand, well, why do we need reserves? Maybe for emergencies, maybe for cash flow, maybe for saving up for projects. That's why they're there. And that's really tends to be what the issue has been. But what does get trickier is there's a huge range among districts. So I guess to some extent, the question is, why are you the way you are? We say it's important to have 10, 15% reserve. Some of you are operating with a lot less, not always sure how. Some of you have much higher reserves. So then it's important, I think, to break into that question of, well, it's a big reserve because we're saving for a textbook purchase and a new bus, and that's how we pay for our roofs. But that ought to be in different funds than your contingency fund or your general fund. So some of it in, just explain not just how many reserves you have, where are they and why? Just echoing what GA said. Just for you to be alert, a week from Monday, the Legislative Post-Audit Committee is going to be receiving the post-audit on cash reserves, cash balances. We spoke to them early in the process. We shared with them a lot of our talking points and information. I have not, no one's leaked to me anything that may be coming out of that, so don't know what to expect, but that may help kind of put a stamp of approval on, hey, you know what districts are doing is reasonable, which we think, and why, or at minimum, talk about, well, what are some guidelines you should follow? But it could be another thing like we've seen in the past. If post-audit raises questions, those questions will show up in the legislature. I can absolutely guarantee that.
Mr. Tallman, I will follow up with you with a question because I know you enjoy talking on this topic much more than I will ever know. But my question really is, do you think our legislature will think it's a little bit more critical that these reserves, these rainy day funds, really that school districts keep for emergencies, for roofs, et cetera, should they be spending these down a little bit more rapidly during COVID, this 100-year pandemic, or are they going to take the standpoint they think they ought to save because potentially excess costs moving forward the next several years?
You know, the problem I think is what legislators sometimes hear is, well, we have reserves for a rainy day, and then when it's raining, well, it might rain harder. So we may need reserves for that. Now, in fact, we've actually seen operating reserves in the last few years come down a little bit as a percentage. But I think what some people, so here again, let me put it, if I'm going to be a skeptical legislator, I'm going to say this. Okay, schools, you've got fewer kids and you have fewer kids in school every day, and some of you don't have kids in school at all. But you want as much money as you had, and you want more money because of Gannon, and you're getting more money from the federal government, and you've got more money in reserves than you had a year ago. That's what people are hearing or will hear. And so there's a response to each of those, which is what we've been walking through. But again, I would say right now, it's hard sometimes for legislators to say, with all the other demands that we're facing, and you told us how important it was to have a rainy day fund, and it's raining, and we don't know where we're going next or what's going to happen. And if you're saying you can't get by, you can't absorb some things with those things you set aside, that's where you run into some skepticism. And again, the people who trust us, who understand what you're doing, that may not bother them. There's others, they're not going to agree. They're going to be skeptical no matter what it is. The pragmatic middle, I call them, who are willing to be educated. they're the kind of people who I think you kind of in some ways have to kind of meet halfway and say, yeah, we know things are tough for everybody. So there's some things we can do because we prepared for this, but don't expect us to do everything. I mean, we still do need X, Y, Z. So I think that's kind of how we need to be facing it.
There's a good point from Lou Faust in the chat about educating legislators and the general public about the patterns of our cash funding. You know, what's you often see cited is, as of July 1st, you know, schools had $1 zillion, you know, in reserves. Well, there's reason for that because of the way funds are distributed throughout the fiscal year. And if you have that pragmatic middle, it's easier to explain that to those folks, but you need to be able to explain it to others as well, why that number looks so big on July 1st, but then tapers off pretty quickly after that.
You know, and Leah, that raises a good point that is brought up. And this is something that is always, I call it a fun fact that will surprise people because it seems so weird. And that is the fact that, many of you know this, but if not, understand, for probably 15 years now, school districts receive a part of their last payment of the year in June. They don't get it till July, but you have to pretend and tell your auditors and show on your books that you got it, even though it isn't there. So if you actually unpack school district funds on July 1st, well, there's a lot of money there. Your general fund technically should have a negative balance because you are waiting to actually get those dollars. And the reason this is maybe important this year is part of how the governor in her allotment order is managing through this crisis was increasing that delay by about $80 million. So that means that this year, the state is in effect saving $80 million that is being pushed to next year. They can do that because you collectively, schools do have cash reserves. So I've kind of put it this way, it's kind of like floating the state another $80 million for a few days to help manage through this. Most people don't understand that. It's very complicated, but it is part of the balance picture. It also explains one other thing to keep in mind, and that's why if you look at a state budget profile, which I've been doing a lot of, it doesn't look like education is getting much of an increase this year because general state aid is not going up in the current year, but then it jumps $170 million next year. Part of that is because you will account for money that you're not actually receiving, but you're going to budget it and you're going to spend it and it's going to be there as far as your books are concerned. But that inflates how much it looks like school districts are going to get next year. And if all the legislator does is kind of look at that profile, they're going to see a big bump. The bump isn't really that big, and it's only there because it's showing a lower amount this year that isn't actually the case.
And one of the things legislators love to say is, well, we're just going to make you spend down your cash reserves. And the reality of it is you do it every year to us. This year, it's going to be even more. So when they say that, just say, yeah, you've been doing it for years and we continue to do it. And we stay healthy because we have cash reserves.
Okay. Any final words or comments to wrap up our conversation over these 5 questions? If our viewers have questions, they can throw those in the chat. But Britton, GA, Mark, Angie, Leah, Scott, anything you'd like to say to kind of wrap this up and prepare our members for the legislative session that's coming at us just as fast as it can?
Well, I might just say, Austin, you mentioned earlier that there are a lot of new legislators coming in. And I think if my percentages are right, about 20% of the House is going to be new members and about 35% of the Senate will be new members, although some of those senators served in the House. So I guess part of our job is to figure out of that number, how many is in Mark's pragmatic middle that we can talk to.
Good insight, Scott.
Thanks.
Be a big learning curve for many of them, to be sure. Difficult enough to step into that role when you're not in the middle of a global pandemic on the tail end of a very difficult 2020. So sure, they're looking forward to getting started there.
I would bring up really quickly for anyone that's not following executive orders from the governor did issue Executive Order 2068. And essentially what it does is the intention is to say for all counties out there that said no to the initial mask mandate. So if you remember Executive Order 2052, I believe it was. Sorry, I have a fly. I keep swatting it out of my office. For those that remember that one, that essentially said when you're in a public place, Kansas, you're going to wear a mask. And so some counties opted out of that. I believe 90 some
By
counties
some, you mean 90%.
opted out of that.
Most.
Most.
So there have been some back and forth with that, but what this new executive order does is say, hey, counties, those of you that opted out of the original mask order, I am telling you once again through this order that you are required to wear a mask when you're in a public place. I'm hoping this fly doesn't go directly up my nostril. But if the counties want to, now keep in mind, they have the authority through House Bill 2016 passed in the special session of last year to come as a county commission and decide that they are not going to, be okay with that they're going to do something to lessen the restrictions because it has to do with public health. But it is going to be back in front of those counties for them to decide. So your county commission may look at that order and say, you know what, we're just not going to go there this time. We're just going to operate as though those mask orders are in place, or your county might be reconsidering that. So just have that in the back of your mind. Also know that I believe House Bill 2016 put limits on the authority to do new state of disaster emergencies under which the governor can issue these orders in a pandemic. And I think that comes to a close in January. So January 21st, if I remember correctly. So there will probably be further legislative action to figure out exactly what the governor's authority is and exactly what controls they want to put in place in moving forward.
I would ask if anybody has any leftover money in their rainy day fund, if they could get Angie Stahlbaumer a fly swatter, would be great.
How are flies still around? I don't understand this.
I think that was Mike Pence's fly.
It's a topic of another time. So
Angie, I just thought you were gesturing dramatically to make your point. So if you
I was desperately hoping it wasn't going to go in my mouth and then you'd see me react in a negative way. But there you go.
I would close by saying just thanking our board members and our superintendents that are on the call, that anytime we have an opportunity to get in front of you is to say thanks, because what you have done is carry the weight of many people's kids and responsibility, and you've done a nice job. I also would say keep on saying the good things and praising those out loud so people can hear them, and continue to shout at the rooftops the things that your kids are doing and the things that they're achieving. So thank you for joining us today, and we appreciate you being here.
Yeah.
I just want to say thank you for being on the call. You're a mighty group, but you also need to tell your friends about this, whether to have them watch this or look at our 5 questions, because we lean on you as our most active people, but we've got to help other school leaders around the state do the same thing, because we've got 165 legislators who need to hear this information.
Yep. Point, Mark. The lesson of the day is tell your own story and help other people tell their stories too, because if we don't tell them, someone else will. So I appreciate the panel jumping on today and walking through Mark's 5 questions. The link to those original blog posts is available in the chat if you want to grab those, and they're floating around on our social media and email channels as well if you'd like to give those a look in a little more detail. As always, if you have questions for us at KASB, never hesitate to reach out. We know the school year is winding down, or this semester is winding down quickly, and the legislative session is winding up quickly. So if you have questions, if you have concerns, if you need help, always feel free to reach out to us. So thank you, everyone, for jumping on today for another wonderful advocacy update, and we'll see you in December.